Hi, everybody, and welcome to December in AI. I'm sure there's going to be a few more people join. And yeah, last session of the year. So let's get started. So, as I think many of you know, I run this session monthly, covering all the big stories from the last month. It's not quite from the last month because we're only on the 18th or 19th of December at the moment, but I wasn't going to work between Christmas and New Year. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Heather. I'm the founder of the AI Edit. I founded it in September this year. And I run these sessions because, well, they're partly for my benefit to keep me up to date on everything that's going on in AI, but also because AI is changing so quickly. And just to keep up to date by following the news or social media is actually quite hard because there's so much going on. And because, as we'll see today, a lot of the people telling the stories have a vested interest in creating some sort of hype or FOMO. So it's very hard for busy people like you guys to stay up to date, build your AI skills, and understand the wider context of how this might impact your own life and work. So we've got 30 minutes to go through the biggest AI stories from December so far, what happened, why it matters. And at the end, I've got about 10 minutes if anybody wants to stick around and have a chat. Always nice to speak to everybody in my network and in the AI edit. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, which you should all be able to see now. We're going to start with the first story, which is about DeepSeek. So DeepSeek is the Chinese lab, Chinese AI lab, and they released two models in December, V3.2 and V3.2 Special. It's supposed to be pronounced the Italian way, apparently. I don't know. And they're claiming via their own benchmarks, which always need to be taken with a pinch of salt, that these models match or beat GPT-5 and Google's Gemini 3 Pro on things like reasoning, maths, and coding. And the Special model even hit gold medal scores supposedly at the International Maths Olympiad. Now, if you remember, DeepSeek released its own reasoning model back in January called R1, and it kind of caused a bit of a stir because it was as powerful and as intelligent as the other mainstream models, but DeepSeek, in their own self-report data, claimed it had been built with much less resource. So 5 million, it had cost 5 million to build that, train that model versus the hundreds of millions that OpenAI and Anthropic had spent on model training. So what's interesting about this new model, the V3.2, is the pricing because it's mostly free. So you get the full model for free. It's open source. But if you're accessing it via the API, which is what like you would be doing in any kind of corporate context, then it's a fraction of the cost of GPT-5 and Gemini, which is going to put a huge amount of pressure on the main AI companies because if you remember, these companies are building for future profits, the promise of future profits, but there is a cheaper competitor, and that's something that might impact that. The one thing that you do need to know about DeepSeek, though, is it doesn't have a multimodal stack. It's only a text model, so there's no image or video gen or anything like that. So, our next story is about money and funding. So, Anthropic has been preparing for at least laying the groundwork for an IPO, which is what the Financial Times reported, potentially as early as 2026. They've hired this law firm called Wilson Sonsini, which is the firm that handled the IPOs for Google and LinkedIn. And supposedly they've hired this firm to start the early stage work of listing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that an IPO is imminent, but it does mean that they are taking it seriously. And Anthropic's CFO helped take Airbnb public, so they've brought in the right kind of talent. And apparently, they're also working through an internal checklist of structural and governance changes to get them IPO ready. Meanwhile, Anthropic is still raising capital privately. They're reportedly looking for a valuation of around 300 billion in their next round, which will put them in the same ballpark as OpenAI. And we've all heard rumors about OpenAI being preparing for its own IPO, potentially at $1 trillion valuation. So this is an important development in the bubble story because there is increasing scrutiny of revenue versus spend. And it's going to be interesting to see whoever lists first. They're kind of going to be a test case where the public markets decide whether these valuations are appropriate. So I think it's going to be an interesting year when we see those IPOs happen. Becoming a public company changes things, it changes the incentives. So, it'll be less of this tech startup race for model capability, and they'll have to think about their shareholders, and they'll have to start thinking about things like predictability, margins, being defensible, etc. So that is definitely a space worth watching. But on the bubble story, despite the fact that there's been a lot of bubble talk about AI valuations being too high and big tech spending going too high, Wall Street banks are actually expecting the stock market to keep climbing in 2026. The FT, and I'll scroll down here so you can actually see the graph because that's quite interesting. The FT did a survey of 9 major investment banks, and they all expect the S&P 500 to rise by the end of 2026. The average gain is around 10%. So you can see Bank of America is down there at about 5%, and Deutsche Bank is the most bullish at almost 17%. So that's another year. I think maybe out of the last 8 years, this would be the 7th year of double-digit growth, even though I think this year the growth was about 17%. So not as high as 2025, but they are still betting on growth. So is this the banks suggesting that the wobble is over and that the kind of sell-off earlier this year was more temporary pullback than a turning point? I don't know. But apparently the 3 main drivers are policy. So in the States, they're expecting easy fiscal, monetary, and regulatory conditions, interest rate cuts, Trump's tax cuts, and basically a favorable regulatory environment. They expect AI to be a tailwind. So they're not necessarily saying that AI is they're looking at AI as a long-term success story, but they're not necessarily saying that it's going to catch up in the short term. And they're expecting interest rates to come down. So we shall see. My next 2 stories are about Anthropic and OpenAI. So we have the story about Anthropic studying its own workforce. So Anthropic did this piece of research where it published an internal study looking at how 132 of its own engineers are using AI in their work. Now, obviously, they're all using Claude, and supposedly they're using it for 60% of their tasks and getting a 50% productivity boost. Now, I would take this with an enormous pinch of salt because, well, these people work for Anthropic, so they've got a vested interest in showing how brilliant AI is in general and Claude is in particular. But also, as we'll see in the next story, I don't think people are very good at estimating their own productivity. I think most people overestimate it. So asking people to estimate this, I think it's meaningless data. But supposedly this is double what they reported a year ago. And the one thing I found most interesting from this research was that 27% of Claude-assisted AI work consists of tasks that wouldn't have been done otherwise. So it's not that they're necessarily doing the same stuff, but doing it faster. They're actually doing things that they might not have bothered before because it wasn't worth the effort. So that's interesting. Is that a good thing or not? I don't know. Do we need to do these things if we could do without them before? I don't know. And they also say they can fully delegate between 0 and 20% of their work to AI, which is a very, very strange stat. So the story got picked up quite a lot, but I'm not really sure why, because no one seemed to ask questions. It got parroted. And to me, it's another example of AI companies creating hype because they all benefit from hype. And Anthropic is trying to get a $300 billion valuation, and an IPO. So the hype is very important to them. So speaking of hype, we now have this story, which is from OpenAI. And honestly, I feel like there are so many flaws in this research, which also got parroted all over the news. And I'm very surprised that no one asked any questions. So OpenAI launched the State of Enterprise AI report called What We're Learning About AI at Work. And this report contained a huge amount of circular reasoning that seems to me to be aimed at showing how brilliant ChatGPT is at helping enterprises, while very clearly trying to create a bit of FOMO. So, as an example, they say that adoption of ChatGPT is accelerating and deepening. So, what that basically means is more people are using ChatGPT now for more things than they were a year ago. But I mean, that's just seems pretty obvious to me. Then they say workers report measurable value from using AI. And again, this is self-reported data from workers. So they looked at usage of ChatGPT and other OpenAI tools, and they surveyed workers as well, right? So they're saying workers report measurable value from using AI, but I don't buy the self-reported data from workers who are not the best people to determine that they're actually more productive. And I remember going through this process before when I was running businesses where if you ask every single worker in a company to estimate their contribution to the success of that firm and you add up all those numbers, you'll get like 10,000%. People are terrible at accurately estimating their own value or productivity. So then we're back to the idea that AI is enabling people to do new kinds of work, which is what the Anthropic survey showed, and then what this one showed as well. So again, people are doing things they couldn't do before, which is interesting, depending on how much of that actually adds value. But then there are two bits of utter nonsense in this report. So the first is they show a widening gap between so-called frontier workers and the median. So what they're actually saying is that the people in the top 5% who use ChatGPT the most use it more than everybody else. It's like very weird circular reasoning because a frontier worker is just somebody in the 95th percentile and above in terms of ChatGPT use. So it's a very strange, and I feel like it's designed to panic enterprises that they might be falling behind on AI adoption as OpenAI is heading towards that big IPO, $1 trillion IPO. But the biggest issue for me on this, and I think I've closed the browser window here, but if you look at OpenAI's Enterprise AI Solutions page, it says, OpenAI says that an enterprise account user of its product will be able to keep financial reports, forecasts, and sensitive business data fully private and under your organization's control. So what they're saying is if you're an enterprise user, your data is yours, yet they have taken that data, anonymized it, and produced this report, which makes me think that they're doing that they have access to this data, and it makes me very, very uncomfortable. So that was a bit of a surprise for me. Back to OpenAI. So the chatbot race has actually become a race, and that's been quite interesting. So OpenAI had a huge early lead in the race to dominate artificial intelligence, and it's now under the greatest pressure it's ever faced because Google and Anthropic and Perplexity to an extent have been gaining ground. But Google is, sorry, really in the middle of a resurgence. Gemini 3, which Google launched last month, has been very highly rated, and it's widely considered to have leapfrogged OpenAI's GPT-5. We're now on GPT 5.2, and it's achieved some pretty incredible gains. And a lot of Google's momentum came off the release of Nano Banana back in August or September this year. And Google, of course, also has this huge distribution benefit, right? They have the benefit of access to a huge existing user base and vast amounts of search data. So yes, it took a while for Google to catch up. And there was a period where I think Google was very worried because it looked like AI search might unseat Google search. What seems to be happening is that Google has managed to turn the narrative around. And we've seen this, we've seen OpenAI panicking as a result. And I think we're going to see a lot more from Google because Gemini is just baked into Android and into Google's wider ecosystem. So people don't actively need to say, I'm going to download Gemini. They're just getting it if they've got an Android phone or a Gmail account. So, yes, ChatGPT is still the leader in terms of brand and usage, but the competition is very real. So, speaking of Google, Google announced that it is going to have another go at the smart glasses market. So I'm sure you can remember back in 2012, 2013, 2014, Google had a brief dalliance in the smart glasses market with Google Glass. And it announced this month that its AI-powered smart glasses are going to launch in 2026. They're going to try and re-enter the category. The hardware is going to be designed by Samsung, and the goal is to make them look more like normal eyewear. So, not some embarrassing new tech trend with a display monitor in front of your right eye. And Meta's kind of paved the way because, much as I can't stand them, Meta's Ray-Ban display smart glasses have proven that people will wear AI-enabled glasses and people do seem to like them. So Google's got a good foundation for this. It's got its strong models, its large app ecosystem, and Gemini is already integrated across so many of its products. So it could be the year that Google cracks this wearable. Right. Then we had Disney teaming up with OpenAI. So this is really interesting. Disney and OpenAI announced a 3-year licensing and investment deal. So under this agreement, Sora being OpenAI's video generation model, Sora users will get access to more than 200 Disney-owned characters from Disney, Marvel, Pixar, and Star Wars. So this is some of the most valuable intellectual property in the world, like Mickey Mouse, Simba, Marvel characters, Star Wars characters. I don't know much about Marvel and Star Wars. So then there's also going to be some AI generated content that's going to appear on Disney Plus. And alongside this deal, and I'm not sure why, Disney is making a $1 billion equity investment into OpenAI. And I think it's an equity swap. So Disney's not like putting the cash in, it's swapping Disney shares for OpenAI shares. And they're going to roll out OpenAI's APIs across all of Disney's products. So importantly, Disney has said that the deal excludes actor likenesses and voices, which is one of the big contentious legal issues at the moment. So I think what that means is you'll be able to create an Iron Man character in Sora, but it won't be Robert Downey Jr.'s face, likeness, or voice. I think I've got that right. And that is literally the entirety of my Marvel knowledge. So if I've got that wrong, hopefully you can work out what I meant by that. So that's pretty indicative of the fact that Disney just isn't fighting AI. It's going all in and it's monetizing its catalog. But also, this is a huge moat for OpenAI because this is effectively an exclusive deal. You're not going to be able to access Star Wars characters in Nano Banana, Google's model. They're licensed, culturally iconic characters. So it feels like the kind of next step in how the media is going to behave. And it is a big win for OpenAI, but a lot of animators and content creators have been saying that they feel like they've been thrown under the bus because their hard work creating these Disney characters has effectively just been exploited. And that brings me to the next story, which is the McDonald's ad. Don't know if you saw it, but McDonald's in the Netherlands released an AI-generated Christmas ad and then had to pull it very quickly because of a backlash. And the backlash was over two things. The first was that it was just a bit of a miserable ad. It was a cynical take on Christmas being the most terrible time of the year, showing all these Christmas disasters, and then basically inviting people to go to McDonald's for happiness over Christmas instead of having to put Christmas go through Christmas themselves. So it was all a bit icky and badly thought out. But the second part of the backlash was that it was entirely AI generated. People called it slop and complained that people had lost out on jobs. And it is worth watching the ad because it's they try and do slapstick with AI generated characters. It just doesn't work. So even though the production company said it took 10 people to make the ad, a lot of people responded by saying, well, sorry, there's like 30 actors and voiceover artists and choristers who didn't get jobs because of this ad. But then what was quite interesting was that a production company then created a takedown in response, also worth watching. I'll send it out after the session. So this is a response video in which the main character from the McDonald's ad eats Burger King, insults McDonald's, and basically suggests that Big Macs are made out of rats. And she basically says, well, I'm just an AI. If this ad had used a real actor, they would have been paid and they would have had a contract buyout and they would have been prohibited from speaking badly about the brand. But I'm an AI, so I can do whatever the hell I want. So that was quite interesting. Then, when it comes to image generation and video generation, OpenAI released its upgraded image generation model, GPT Image 1.5, and everybody has said it is much better particularly at following instructions. So you can edit it more precisely and it works a lot faster. So OpenAI is potentially catching up with Google. Then we had Merriam-Webster announcing that its 2025 word of the year was slop. And of course, slop means low quality digital content of low quality that's produced usually in quantity by means of artificial intelligence. And I have to say, I agree. People are calling this the slop economy. And if anyone spent any time on LinkedIn, you will probably agree with that. And this came after Oxford chose rage bait as its word of the year, and Collins went with vibe coding. So it was definitely the year of AI, which is what Time decided. So Time magazine names its person of the year every year in December. And this year, instead of naming one person, they named the architects of AI as the person of the year. So that included Jensen Huang, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Fei-Fei Li, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, Demis Hassabis, and Lisa Su, who's the CEO of AMD. So it's not the first time the award's gone to multiple people. It was given to the people fighting Ebola in 2014 and collectively to whistleblowers in 2002. And if you want to find out about most of these people, not all of them, then I will send out my AI billionaires video. It's a 15-minute session on who these people are. Then we had the reasoning models that aced the CFA exam. So this was a study by Cornell University, which found that 6 leading AI models can now pass all 3 levels of the Chartered Financial Analyst exams with performance in the high 90s. So they tested these models across 980 questions, covering all 3 tiers of the CFA exam. So tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, which is the hardest, I think. So these are the hardest financial exams in the world. So obviously this is a big deal. And I already covered this in my September in AI update because the models had already passed the CFA exams then. But back then they were scoring like 70. Now they're scoring like 97. So this is obviously a big deal. But what's changed is that the scores have gone up, but passing the exam is not the same as doing the job. And the area where they fell down was ethics. And the other criticism is that how much of this exam content has actually been fed into the training model, which means that the data might be contaminated. I released a study yesterday about AI and children. I commissioned a study of 150 UK parents to look at the extent to which AI is already part of childhood. And unfortunately, it absolutely is. So I've published the results here on the Humans in the Loop. But what shocked me was that 63% of children are already using chatbots like ChatGPT and Claude. And not just every now and then, daily or weekly. So this is something that we really do need to focus on. It's going to be a big focus for me next year, especially since most schools don't have AI in the curriculum, But we've got all sorts of things going on, like schools trialing hiring deepfake teachers, which to me is very concerning. Right, last two stories. Very quick one. Amazon had an AI recap feature that it was trialing in Prime Video. So if you started watching a new Amazon show, I think it was mainly in the US, and you could get an AI generated recap of the last season. So this show, Fallout, was one of the ones where it was trialed, but they had to pull it because users noticed that it had hallucinated and there were loads of mistakes in the summaries of season one. So, for example, claiming that one scene was set more than 100 years later than it actually was. So, we're still not quite there yet, which is interesting. Then we have another data and privacy story. So, ScotRail, which is a Scottish railway company, they had to launch a new AI onboard announcer after the original AI onboard announcer created some controversy. So basically, what happened, they had a voiceover artist called Gayanne Potter who discovered that her voice was being used without her permission to train an AI announcer on ScotRail. The announcer was called Iona. And this Gayanne Potter had been hired a while ago, before voice cloning became a thing, by a Swedish technology firm called Reed Speaker. And she was told that her voice would be used for accessibility and e-learning software. And then she discovered that it was being used by ScotRail as an announcer. So as a result, they had to pull the voice and replace it with another AI announcer. This new one is based on the voice of one of their own employees. Whether this employee got extra compensation or gets to withdraw her permission at any time, we don't know. But they said the new voice has now been ethically produced and that people are at the heart of everything they do. And it is very fitting that the voice of ScotRail now comes from within their own team. So I think this whole situation raises a lot of questions about protections for artists who have shared their voice and their likeness with anybody who might use that to train a model. So that is it for December in AI. Very quick run through of the major stories from December. Been an eventful month. January's Insider Briefing is available to book on the AI Edit website. It is on the 29th of January. I'm sure it'll be a big one because it'll be covering 6 weeks really rather than 4. So thank you very much for joining me. I hope everybody has a lovely festive break, and I look forward to seeing you at one of my sessions in 2026 or joining the AI Edit or one of the events that I'm speaking at. I'm speaking at quite a few events in Q1, but have a lovely festive break.